Welcome to People's Republic with Brian Griffith. We bring you news and analysis from the front lines of the global struggle for social and economic justice. People's Republic originates on KOOP Austin and is also syndicated on WHIV New Orleans. I'm your host, Brian Griffith, and here's what's going down in your backyard and across the world. This week we are talking about the grant that was just put through to establish a public defender's office within Travis County, Texas. A lot of kind of good things coming out of this and a lot of potential pitfalls to this as well. We are joined for this episode by Chris Harris, who's an organizer around criminal justice reform here in Austin. Thank you, Chris, very much for coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Always glad to have you on. So can you give us kind of just the general rundown of, first of all, why it is we kind of need better public defense here? Because, you know, when we were talking before the show about the state of, just general defense for basically defense for kind of poor people and generally working class people, there's so little available. And just hearing about it was in many ways kind of horrifying. So can you maybe just kind of give us a rundown of, the state of affairs as they stand?
Sure. So, the Sixth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution was decided in Gideon v. Wainwright back in the early 60s to guarantee the right of people who are unable to afford counsel to that counsel. And so how that works is basically the states, and then really in most of the South, that ends up being the counties are kind of on the hook to provide that counsel to people. And how that applies is if you're charged with anything, a Class B misdemeanor or above, and you are unable to afford representation in the form of a defense lawyer, then the county in Texas is obligated to provide one for you. You know, it's really been a struggle ever since that decision across, a lot of this country to actually live up to the goals of that decision and ensure actual equal representation for people that are unable to afford counsel. So what we found in Austin is that, we're kind of a little over 4 years into an experiment in something called managed assigned counsel, where, before this experiment, we had a system where the judges, the district court and criminal court judges would directly assign an attorney to someone deemed unable to afford counsel. And of course, this has all sorts of problems in that these judges would, often appoint people that they knew or familiar with or were friendly with. Obviously, a lot of the judges also receive campaign contributions, since in Texas we have elected judges from some of these same lawyers that they then would appoint right into these cases. So lots of conflict of interest. And without independence, you can't be sure that your defense counsel is going to provide you the best defense. If they're worried more about maintaining friendly relations with the judge who ultimately controls whether or not they get work, of course, you're gonna be really doing the judge's bidding more than you're going to be helping your client in a lot of cases. So they went to a system where an independent arbiter, supposedly independent arbiter, the Capital Area Private Defender Service in 2014 was created to manage the assignment of counsel. So it's this managed assigned counsel system. So it's still all private lawyers kind of working on their own. But this group now would offer training, would offer certifications, would ensure that the right, type of lawyer or seasoned lawyer that can handle that type of case that someone was charged with would get assigned. And the lawyers could kind of make themselves available to this group. And then there's a rotating wheel through which those assignments are handled. And the judges, are not supposed to have a role in that process. And so 4 years in, it's a good time to see, is it working? And what we found in a couple of reports last year, one an annual evaluation that the county does, and another a report that was produced by the district attorney, really financed by the district attorney, released by the Council on State Governments, found that, these managed assigned counselors were not doing well. So basically, they looked at a specific charge and found that the number one, the biggest factor in determining whether or not someone would be convicted for that charge or not was whether or not they had a retained counsel, meaning that they had the money to pay for a lawyer versus whether or not they had one of these assigned counsel. Now there's a lot to unpack from the whole report, and some of it is hard to judge apples to apples, and that's what the private lawyers will tell you. But I think one of the biggest things that was most glaring to me was that if you had a hired attorney and 6 to 10 prior arrests, okay, you are less likely to be convicted than if you had a managed assigned counsel, one of these private attorneys that was assigned to you, and 0 prior arrests.
Wow. That's incredible.
Yeah. So you could literally have like no rap sheet at all, get one of these assigned counselors and be more likely to be convicted for these possessions of a controlled substance charges than if you had the money to hire your own attorney and been arrested 6 to 10 times previously.
Jesus.
Yeah. So managed assigned counsel was clearly not working, right? It is not working. And so like, let's also get into a little bit of why this system isn't working, because as we were also talking about, some of these assigned counsels are taking, you said 500 to 600 cases a year of all types, essentially making like 200,000 a year or more just to on indigent defense. So like that, they're taking on just as many cases as they possibly can. This is about almost 2 cases a day in some cases. Yeah, that's right. So one of the things that this managed assigned counsel system, one of the things that it really doesn't do is provide the level of oversight and controls necessary to ensure that the lawyers that get assigned these cases actually do a good job. And one of the, clearest examples of that is that there is no limitation apparently on the number of cases that a lawyer could take. So, they have the ability to turn themselves on or off from this wheel that will assign them cases as they come up. And it appears that some of these lawyers just never turn themselves off and take all the cases. So, there are numerous reports from around the country about how many cases a lawyer can take. And obviously it differs, right? Based on the complexity of the case, the severity of the charge. Like there's a lot of gray in it, but it's clear that no one should be taking more than 300 cases a year. And you had in just fiscal year 18, you had 25 lawyers take that many cases. And that's a hefty percentage of the cases. And that's for lawyers that worked at some point in Travis County that year. So and some of those lawyers are making upwards of 200,000 or more. And only on the representation of people unable to afford counsel. And they're doing this, mind you, under a system that I will grant pays them very poorly, right? So the system that we have today that is going to be changed by what just got passed is one that pays them per case a flat fee. There's one amount for misdemeanors and another for felonies. And it is really low. And so it incentivizes them to take a lot of cases if they want to make a lot of money. And I think the question is, how much money should someone expect to make off of indigent defense?
Yeah, it almost like that system almost sounds very like Better Call Saul-esque. Like, for people who watch the previous, it's probably horrifying you to hear, like as someone who studies so much of this. But it almost reminds me of like that kind of setup, where it's just like some dude who's just taking case after case after case and putting in as little work as possible, just because if it pays a flat fee, and just thinking of like just doing the math here, like if you're taking this many cases a year, and off this would kind of equate to like 2 cases a day in some points. That's assuming an 8 to 10 hour workday. That's 4 to 5 hours working on somebody's case. I just feel like people deserve so much better than that.
100%. Yeah, and we have a justice system that's already very much designed currently towards the plea bargain, right?
Yeah.
It gives the prosecutors a lot of discretion. It has a lot of different types of offenses, which allow them to charge at various different levels and really put a lot of pressure on people through what we call a trial penalty. So, if you take this to trial, I'm going to charge you with X, Y, and Z, and you could get 20 years, or you can plead this out right now and get 15 months, or get, a year, 18 months, get 2 years, get 3 years. And so when people are staring 10, 15, 20 years of their life, in behind bars, they're very inclined to take a plea. So you already have that sort of situation, but then you put the people that are supposed to represent the people facing that plea in a position where they're incentivized to, as quickly as possible, get rid of this case. What do you think they're going to do? They're going to recommend that the person take the plea. And they're going to do that even if they have not put in the time to even understand the case or know, all of the things that go into it, and whether or not this person actually did or did not do it, or whether or not they have a case to say they should be charged with a lesser offense, or a whole number of other remedies potentially that could come into play for their client. So it's something where you see all these factors as you kind of unpack the onion of criminal justice, and you start to understand why 95% of cases plea out. And this is, and it's because it's all kind of set up, especially with our minors assigned counsel system here, and the pay and the way that cases were paid out here to do that.
And if, with this 95% of cases pleading out, I always think of how many of these cases would, if you actually had the resources to take this to court, many of these cases, so many wouldn't hold up either because of some sort of entrapment by police or whatnot. Like so many of these are kind of on these kind of various trumped up charges. And essentially it does. It's a criminalization of the poor in so many ways. It's a way to kind of keep the poor in this kind of destitution and essentially like force them into, through the gears of this system. So I'm wondering if we can now kind of pivot to the grant for the public defender's office that was just applied for, and sort of what that hopes to kind of solve.
Yeah. So, the idea behind the public defender as opposed to the managed assigned counsel of private lawyers is that you create an entity that is an institution that is able to have and provide more holistic representation. That obviously has the ability to hire specific attorneys because of their own skill sets and viewpoints about providing defense to people that are unable to afford counsel, and also that have the sort of mix of skills and experience in order to provide what's called holistic representation. So really to look at all of the potential impacts on that person within the criminal justice system, whether that be immigration impacts, whether that be if they have kids and they have, social work, whether there's drug treatment issues, whether there's mental health issues, really, an entity set up and designed to provide the most, again, holistic representation to each individual to provide the best outcome for them. One that also is, providing really robust training and has the ability to force all the people to go to it because they're employees of an entity, right? Mm-hmm. And to enact and actually control standards for the attorneys and how they operate because, again, they're employees of an entity rather than a bunch of hired guns. And so, that is one kind of small part of it. The other thing is that a public defender itself can be is really well positioned to understand kind of the entirety of the local criminal justice situation, and to be an advocate for the accused, and to not only advocate for them on an individual basis as their assigned cases, but also to think about the holistic issues that really the widespread systemic issues, I should say, with how cases are being prosecuted, how police are operating, how cases are being tried, what kind of science is allowed in the courtroom, like all these different things, right? And more than one individual attorney can, as an entity, as a big institution, it can actually help fight those things, right? And be an advocate to change systems and institutions rather than just fight kind of one-on-one cases. So there's a lot of benefits to a public defender. Again, there can be issues, particularly where they don't have caseload limits. And so that was one of the things that was most important for us as we, really worked within the working group structure created by the county commissioners to create the public defender. But it's clear when you have those that public defenders provide way better defense on an individual basis. I mean, some of the studies that are out there comparing that are, I think, really get to the apples to apples issues, show, reductions in pretrial detention for people unable to afford counsel. And again, this is comparing a public defender to assigned private counsel. They get, again, their clients have reduced pretrial detention, meaning that they're not held because they can't pay bond near as long. They have lesser convictions, right? So they have a lower conviction rate, meaning more cases get dismissed or other sorts of outcomes or dispositions. And when their clients do get convicted, they get shorter sentences. And so in all of these different ways, they're able to produce better outcomes for their clients. And obviously those clients are not individuals in this world. They have families, right? They have dependents. And so for all the people that are reliant on this person, right? Whether it's kids, whether it's, grandparents, whether it's, whomever, all of them don't have to suffer from all of these, additional consequences that criminal justice involvement brings, or they at least can minimize the amount of suffering that they have. So, it's a public defender is a really, really important role in ensuring that the criminal justice system, is the least oppressive version of itself as it can be for anyone who's able to be represented by one.
Yeah, if you're just tuning in, you are listening to People's Republic with Brian Griffith. People's Republic originates on KOOP 91.7. We are also broadcast on WHIV 102.3 FM New Orleans, and we are available as a podcast wherever podcasts are podded. We are speaking with Chris Harris, who's an organizer with Grassroots Leadership, about the grant that was just applied for Travis County to have a holistic public defender's office. Taking 30% of cases. So we just talked about all the positives. I would like to also get into some of what you see as kind of the potential issues arising here, and some of the clear kind of corruption and conflict of interest that are kind of coming up in this. Yeah.
So, I think it's clear. One thing I just want to be clear about is that, basically the county did agree to apply for the grant to create the public defender. I want to make certain that's understood, and that's a great thing. And that public defender is going to take 30% of cases it's going to take 15% of cases starting in next fiscal year. It should take 15% of cases. So from October to September. And then after that, it will be taking 30% of all the cases for people that can't afford counsel for now. And that's really, really important. And again, for the people that get assigned that public defender, at minimum, they should see much better outcomes and results on an overall basis for their interactions with the criminal legal system. There are still some things to be worked out with that. So we had a proposal, the Indigent Legal Services Working Group that those of us were on, that was created by the County Commissioner's Court, that kind of also spoke to hiring the chief of the public defender, spoke to the oversight of the public defender in ways that really met best practices, and we're going to ensure that it was the best office that it could be. Some of those things were taken out of the final proposal that was voted on by the county. And this was done really at the behest of the judges, which is really unfortunate. And so some of that was, made a little bit better by the county commissioners, but there's still a lot of work to be done to ensure that a good chief gets hired and that chief process is not run by the judiciary, who should not have a role in indigent defense. I mean, I think there was a good analogy made at one of the county commissioners meetings that basically having the judges get to pick lawyers or be involved in the public defender is like having the referee in a basketball game also be the manager of one of the teams. It doesn't make any sense, and it's going to ensure an unequal outcome, right? So there's that element of it. I think the area though that is really most telling and most disturbing of the proposal as it was actually voted out is the components as far as paying the private defense lawyers. So we have 30% of cases going to public defender in the future, but that means 70% of the cases for people that are unable to afford counsel are going to continue to be going to these private defense attorneys, right? Mm-hmm. And, one of the things we said all along is the public defender could help actually improve those lawyers as well, because it would be providing some institutional help to just the system overall, right? But then also there's a lot of minutia about lawyering that the public defender, because it's not a private entity that's just working on its own and by itself, will be able to provide and share basically collectively with the private defense community, including things like training and motions and all this other stuff. So we hope that all the defense level will be raised by the public defender once it's up and running. That said, there's still a big issue with the 70% of cases, because we know that the entity that's been managing those cases hasn't been doing it very well, and that the lawyers that have been providing cases out of that, while there are very much some really good lawyers that take those cases, there are also a lot of lawyers taking way too many cases, and they can't possibly do a good job with them all. And then there's others that are simply just, that don't do well. They're either not very good or are don't have the proper motivations to do the work. And so without improvements to that entity for these remaining 70%, it really doesn't matter how much we pay them. But what the judges did is they basically forced that the grant proposal to create the public defender also include a hefty pay raise for all these private defenders. And what they did, which it really, I think, points to to the potential corruption that exists with between the private defense bar community, really represented by the Austin ACDLA and the judges, is that, our proposal, we acquiesced and added in some additional money to those lawyers, but we did that contingent upon the outcome of a third-party evaluation of their operations, so that another entity could come in, see how they're assigning cases now, see how they're paying cases now, make improvements for recommendations for how to manage all that, and ensure better representation for poor people that have to get managed assigned counsel. And what the judges did is said, no, we're going to remove that evaluation. We don't think that's necessary. And, you've proposed hourly pay contingent on that evaluation for the most severe cases. We think they should all get hourly pay, and they should get it right away with no evaluation. And so what they've done is basically, they forced in a public defender proposal, basically a quid pro quo, which is money going to the private lawyers that many of them are very tight with. Again, many of them contribute to their election campaigns. Judges here are elected. And so it smacks of corruption, and it's awful. And so I don't think that any money should have gone to the private defense bar as part of the public defender proposal. It should never have been a part of it. It's a completely different conversation. I think that paying the lawyers hourly ultimately is the way to go, but we should be sure that the lawyers that are taking that money and are getting these cases are going to do a good job, and they're going to do what they say they're going to do. I think, the number one thing I'll say is, if they were willing to game the system and hurt their poor clients in the old way, where they're getting paid a flat fee per case, why wouldn't they be willing to do the same thing when they're getting paid hourly, right? And just fudge the hours, say they did X, Y, and Z, and who's going to check? No one. So, it's really foolish to be giving them all this money without additional oversight and compliance measures. The other thing is, how much money does it take to make a bad lawyer good? If you are practiced that for years, meeting with your client, and on the same day you meet with them, having a plea deal and not trying to work the case at all, are you suddenly going to become a good lawyer who, uses investigators, uses social workers, uses immigration attorneys when it's warranted because you now have the opportunity to be paid hourly? I don't see it, not without, again, additional oversight and compliance standards for these attorneys. And again, the judges didn't think that was important. In fact, removed that part from the proposal. So we're very much, disappointed with that part of it. because we don't think that it's necessarily going to improve defense for clients that still get managed assigned counsel, but it is going to improve the pocketbooks of the lawyers that take those cases.
Yeah, I think in the process of this struggle, you really revealed a lot about the way the criminal justice system, so-called criminal justice system works, or the criminal injustice system, or whatever various people want to call it. But, regardless, kind of with this kind of struggle to establish a public defender's office, in revealing that these judges are essentially trying to remove all oversight from these private lawyers, revealed this kind of this systemic issue that very much appear like by all accounts, anyone would look at this and clearly recognize it as inappropriate. And so I think it's important that it's only through struggle that we kind of notice these things. As Rosa Luxemburg said, those who don't move don't notice their chains, kind of thing. And I think that's kind of very important. So we have a few minutes left. I'd like to briefly get into kind of another issue that I should have talked about earlier, but that, definitely mentions kind of a bit of a discussion, which is kind of Austin Police Department's collaboration with ICE that's been revealed. I believe that kind of came as part of the new reporting from the Freedom Cities policy that Austin passed. If you can just kind of give us a rundown of what has been revealed as far as Austin Police Department collaborating with ICE.
Sure. Well, I will first say that I'm sure I won't be able to speak to this as eloquently as some of the people doing great immigration organizing and advocacy in this town. But I will say that yes, these reports are part of the picture. Where last year in the Freedom City policy, there was really two planks, and one was to basically very much restrict or limit the arrest for offenses where police were authorized to give a ticket or a citation. And so that was one plank. And the other was to, as best as possible underneath the confines set in place by SB 4 passed in the Texas legislature in 2017, limit local police involvement with ICE and ultimately, because that's really difficult underneath the current law, to also provide reporting about that and about all of their requests for resources that ICE makes of APD and all the times they comply and how much that costs and all the man hours. And so I think we've now received two different reports as they're supposed to come quarterly about that. And, I think it's quite illuminating in terms of, there's a lot of these that's illuminating, but, one is that, APD continues to report and to say publicly and to report that people are not being asked about their immigration status during police encounters. So that's one of the reporting requirements. And, I think that for the folks that are running the various, immigration hotlines in town, including the folks at grassroots leadership, that's not the experience that people are calling to report in. And so I think that, that's really important to note and to understand. And then I think otherwise, even what is reported is really, it's illuminating. So, how many times ICE is requesting things like utility bills and all these other sort of really private elements of people's lives that APD is complying with, right? And again, to the extent that they're not allowed to comply, I think there's definitely different interpretations of that. But it at minimum shows you the reach of ICE into our community and how the police department continues to play a big role into that reach. And I think, one of the other things that we found is that, again, in contrary to some of the reports that make it seem ultimately that APD isn't doing, as much as we think we hear, there was recently a case out of the U.S. Attorney's Office where it was learned through some discovery that basically, the Austin Police Department was surveilling someone on behalf of ICE and ultimately went to their house based on a mental health call to a different address and used that mental health call in the general vicinity of this person's house as a reason to go to their house and surveilled them. And ultimately they were arrested and now are being charged in federal court. So on immigration offenses. So it's it's a really scary time within the immigrant community at large and the undocumented community in general. It's quite clear that the systems of law enforcement all the way up and down the chain are sort of united in identifying, surveilling, and finding folks and apprehending them for doing nothing more than being here and trying to live their lives. And a lot of folks that have no criminal legal system involvement and have been here for a long time. But it's also insidious for someone that does have criminal legal system involvement, and they have no less right to the opportunity to live in freedom and peace and and to have equal justice and due process under the law. So it's a really it's something where this continues to be a really important struggle locally at the state level and nationally to defend our brothers and sisters in the immigrant community.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, so much of everything we talk about kind of coalesces around kind of the issues of like systemic power and how the issue, like how does the state, like sort of the theoretical state that is like the police and surveillance and military and all these kind of different apparatuses, how do they function together? What cogs are there? And, sort of how do these different machines, if you look inside them, like how do they function in a lot of ways? And I think we're seeing that, especially with that kind of collaboration between, as we're talking about Austin Police Department and ICE, for instance, where, I think that's absolutely so much of what's asked of ICE is absolutely absurd, or what ICE asks of police departments is absurd. The fact that they're so kind of willingly compliant really speaks volumes about how these organizations really, in many ways, serve the same different tasks of sort of largely oppressing the already most oppressed people, like, conducting the either mass surveillance or individual surveillance on, Black and brown communities and, just on the poor in general.
And this is supposed to be a sanctuary city.
Yeah, exactly. Even though, again, like, and that's another point at which kind of the state, meaning the state of Texas at this point, intervened and basically said, no, you're not allowed to have that. Right. So much more, I wish we could talk about. We're going to go ahead and have to wrap it up. We have been joined by Chris Harris. He's an organizer around criminal justice issues of all sorts, based here in Austin. Thank you once again, Chris, for coming on the show.
Always enjoy it.
You're listening to People's Republic. People's Republic originates on KOOP 91.7 Austin, is also broadcast on WHIV 102.3 FM New Orleans. We are also available as a podcast on Spotify, Spreaker, Stitcher, iTunes, or wherever podcasts are podded. Stay tuned. We are looking at the kind of a labor organizing that's happening around the University of Texas at Austin. There's a group that has first held a kind of rally for May Day and then later kind of grade in to kind of demonstrate the value of especially, academic, intellectual labor at the University of Texas. The group is called Underpaid at UT. And has been doing some real interesting stuff and has sort of is developing sort of a game plan for the next year. So in our attempt to continue to cover labor issues, especially around the South, we are joined by one of the organizers of Underpaid at UT. Thank you very much. This is Giorgos Stratis coming on the show. Thank you very much, Giorgos, for being here.
You're welcome. Thanks for inviting us.
I'm wondering if you can just kind of give us a rundown of kind of how Underpaid at UT started, and sort of how you've been able to kind of build momentum as you've gotten your feet off the ground.
Sure. So Underpaid at UT is more of a grassroots movement. Like, essentially, we didn't have an infrastructure that forced us to come together. It was individuals that decided one way or another that we had enough. But the main events that caused the creation of our group was first the tax plan that was proposed in the December 2017, if I'm correct, by the federal government, and essentially that will have taxed graduate students, and we're already underpaid, and that meant that we're gonna be paying more money out of our pocket, and we're already below the living wage here in Austin. So that was the first event. As a result of that tax plan, there was a protest at UT, and that caused a graduate student assembly at the University of Texas to create a subcommittee called the Graduate Student Labor Committee. I might be missing one or two letters in the name of the committee, but point being, there was a Graduate Labor Committee. I came together and sent a survey to the graduate students, and we asked across the university, how much money do you make? How much do you pay for rent? Long story short, there was a series of town halls last fall from September to December. And the last town hall, which I was part of, I met other people, and we basically were chit-chatting and we realized that there is a niche. There's an unsatisfied niche, essentially, where there's no organization outside of UT proper. Essentially, all the organizations are through the UT system, one way or another, like the Graduate Student Assembly is part of UT. We just need an independent voice. We need a movement that focused on labor issues and was not liable to UT. It was not connected to UT through its administration. So starting in end of January, probably a group of around 10 of us, believe it or not, came together and we started Underpaid at UT. And here we are.
Yeah, it's very exciting stuff. I'm wondering, what specifically sort of the life of a grad student kind of looks like at this point. Both in terms of sort of the living conditions, the working conditions, and the pay conditions. There are a couple different kind of, I think, generally categories of people who go into grad school, some of which come from enough privilege to be able to, float the tens of thousands of dollars or often much, much more in order to go to grad school. But for everybody else, especially for those from the working class, for Black and brown people, it becomes so much kind of more of a struggle to kind of fit in. So yeah, I'm wondering if you can just kind of go through kind of your own experiences and also kind of what you were hearing from people as sort of like the main issues that people are running into.
So graduate school is such a diverse place, but not in a diversity we're thinking about. Basically, there is diversity in how people experience labor. But let me give you a couple of examples where UT is messing with us, essentially. For example, at the beginning of every academic year, our semester starts end of August. However, our first salary for that academic year comes in the end of September. That means pretty much for 2 months, from August to 1st of October, you don't have a salary, which means you have to either save money the year before, or you have to take up a loan, or your family will support you. Point being, why do we do that? Why do we have to spend pretty much 2 months without any financial support from an institution? It's something that UT knows about. It happens every single year. So that's one example. Another thing is that many people take a second job. And you might say you're a graduate student, you're a student, how much work do you put? Well, let me tell you, if we don't work, nothing works at UT. There are 40,000 undergraduate students. Who do you think teaches them? Who do you think grades their homework, their exams? Who holds the discussion sections? So essentially, there's all this labor that we have to do. And on top of that, we have to do a second job. Now, if you're an international student like me, you cannot work a second job because based on visa regulations, you can work up to 20 hours. Well, that means that we are basically left with whatever salary UT gives us. Now, let's say that you have a family. How would you feed a family of 4 if you make below $20,000 a year? I mean, I just still, I cannot understand how people survive in grad school. And that's why there's no much diversity. That's one of the reasons. If you have a family, if you're somebody who cannot pay that extra month of September, you don't have money saved, and you don't come from a privileged family, then pretty much you decide not to go to grad school.
So then basically that narrows down the kind of person for whom grad school is a viable option. And of course, the reactionary kind of thing to say would be, not to go to don't go to grad school if you can't afford it or that sort of thing. But then that just it leads to kind of the narrowing down of kind of ideological diversity. It leads to the narrowing down of so much, and it doesn't really get at so many the base kind of issues there. Is that like this does need to be accessible for people from all walks of life. This kind of access to, and that's a problem I generally have with kind of university institutions anyway, is the kind of walling off of access to the information produced, where so much of research winds up behind a paywall. And so that sort of thing, even the access to be able to study that information has to come from people who have that kind of the privilege to be able to essentially quit whatever it is they were doing for years of their life and kind of commit themselves to either like racking up a massive amount of debt, or who are just have the money to just kind of pay this off. And either way, it's just, it's not, doesn't appear to be kind of a sustainable system in the long term. I also, as you were saying, like so much of the labor at UT and so much of the labor just generate universities comes from either adjunct professors or grad students who are doing kind of the bulk of the teaching, the bulk of the grading, and all that, and are often paid less than $20,000 a year to live off, while at the same time having to pay tuition, while often having to do that sort of thing. Then you look at the job prospects, and it's the same thing. You get to go from being a grad student making less than $20,000 a year to being an adjunct professor making, I don't know, a few thousand per class or so, per semester long class. And yeah, it really completely eliminates the kind of person who's able to go to grad school to kind of the most privileged sectors of society.
Oh, definitely. And if you see, I'm in the STEM field, by the way, I'm a physics PhD candidate. If you think that the average physics candidate needs 6.5 years to graduate, that means you're in 6.5 years on a low wage. But the idea is that you're going to enter in a field, an industry that pays a lot of money. Well, that's one of the reasons why that field is not diverse. If there's a barrier to entry, if someone has to go through 6.5 years of low payment, low wages, in order for you to make a decent living later, or a good amount of money, then that tells you something. Despite how much UT and other institutions say that they fight for diversity, when it boils down, they can do some basic things. Pay us more. And ask yourself, do we really have the money or not? And I will say yes, we do have money to pay everyone a living wage. And you may wonder why I say that. Look at our administrative people, the people who run the university, the executives, president, provost, and compare them with other institutions across the US. A, they make a lot of money anyway, and B, they make more money on average than other institutions. So we do have the funds. The money is there. It's a matter of priorities, and it's clear that UT is not prioritizing us.
Yeah, if you're just tuning in, you're listening to People's Republic with Brian Griffith. We were talking with Giorgos Stratis, an organizer with the group Underpaid at UT. We're talking about kind of labor issues at UT. So I know one of the criticisms of the kind of grad school expectations, the kind of ideological backing of grad school, is that it's supposed to be this kind of trial by fire, that the idea is like you go to grad school in order for them to kind of break you down and kind of rebuild you is what it feels like. And it seems like a lot of time grad school is treated like this absolute sort of a baptism by fire. I'm wondering how much you've seen that and what you can identify sort of the problems with understanding higher education to function that way.
Definitely. If you talk with many of the faculty in our university, most of them are of the mentality that you're here, you have to suffer in order to earn your right. They act like gatekeepers. However, there's a ginormous power in differential between the faculty and us. We do not have any proper grievance procedure. We do not have a way to report any abuse of power, and there's no punishment to the faculty. So essentially what happens is that they have all the power and they can abuse us in any way or form if they want to do it. There are many good people out there, but for those, the bad apples at UT, there's no recourse, there's no good punishment for them. And there's no way to support the graduate students in any way or form. And why do we have this mentality of, as you said, you have to suffer through? Why don't we have it as a constructive experience? I do not understand it. It's like, we are with the medieval ages, like you have to suffer in order to make a living wage. Like, it's just ridiculous. We're here to learn, not to suffer. We're here to make this place a better place. We're here to make more research for UT. We're here to put Texas on the research map. We're not here to suffer. It's clear.
Part of the process of sort of accumulating student debt, because that of course is going to be, I think, one of the things that breaks the economy in the near future. That bubble at some point is going to have to burst, just because of the sheer amount of weight that's being put on people. But I think that that also kind of narrows down the conversations, essentially the kind of discourse happening, and it like being burdened with student debt makes you more likely to take on kind of conservative ideas when you're, for instance, doing research or whatnot, because say you're doing this kind of intellectual labor, if you're worried that, like, if you don't have any debt, you can you have enough of independence where you can kind of put forth the ideas that you want to put forth without any sort of kind of forces acting upon you. Whereas if you have a huge student loan payment every month to make, then you're kind of forced in this position where you have to take kind of more safe opinions on whatever the case is. So you're less likely to sort of challenge these kind of power structures if you're saddled with this kind of debt, at least from my perspective.
Definitely. And probably that's one of the reasons why the graduate labor movement, or in general student movements in the US, is pretty, tamed, because essentially you have to make a choice. Many of us have thousands and thousands of dollars in debt. That means probably your number one priority is to pay that and have a free life, let's say. So you organizing and trying to go against the system, it just puts you at a lot of risk. So, and it goes back to what I said before, due to the power imbalance between professors and students, you will definitely challenge it far less. Because if you lose support from a faculty, you're on your own. When you're on your own, you cannot pay your loan. So,
yeah,
I mean, do the math, essentially. That's why people just choose more conservative, as you said, it's not necessarily that they vote differently or they broadcast different opinions, but they definitely do not say anything that will push the boundary.
I'd also like to talk kind of briefly about the value of intellectual labor, because I think for a very long time, even this sort of distinction between physical or manual labor on one hand and kind of the intellectual labor really does not get at what labor really looks like and how labor kind of functions. Because having occupied both spheres, having done everything from sort of like grunt work at tech startups, like $10 an hour, where it's just sort of manual kind of moving stuff around, and having, on the other hand, like been kind of more, in a program director role in like nonprofits or whatnot, where I am doing kind of the more intellectual stuff, across that sphere, it's really, in many ways, it's the same kind of work. It all has a kind of very similar outcomes, and like there's not really one that I think is necessarily more or less oppressive than the other, but I think that divide is so kind of heavy in people's minds of like, well, you might not be doing kind of quote unquote real work if you're in academia, or if you're in that kind of role.
Well, you're addressing an important issue, and that's basically this issue is behind why most people do not see us as workers, which we are. People are like, they're thinking that we're students and we're in libraries behind books reading for our leisure, and that's not labor. The issue is that most of the revolutions that happen, economical revolutions and whatnot in our society, happen from people who didn't do manual labor don't work for the sake of making money, essentially. You have a lot of creativity unleashed in this whole academic environment. And that's when people become more productive, more revolutionary ideas come out that transform our societies. And the reality is that we don't know what's the next big thing. We don't know what's going to make our society a better place. So saying that you have to do blue-collar work or manual labor in order to earn your wage is just misleading, because why, if we can make our life easier, why shouldn't we do it? And a lot of transformations in our economy happen from people who didn't seek to make more money per se, but they were going after a passion, an interest, and essentially they just stumbled upon a new idea, a new invention. Think about the internet, World Wide Web. Think about computers. Think about airplanes. I mean, all these things happen not because these people were doing manual labor, like Steve Jobs and all these people that are being worshipped. I mean, I'm not a huge fan of them, but what point being is that these people were passionate about the thing that people didn't know it was going to make money. So what I'm trying to say is that our labor, we might not be able to determine right now its economic value, but that's not why you should do what you do. Many times in free societies, we're in a society that people should pursue their dreams and their efforts, and they should be given space and as many resources as possible to flourish. So I think the academic labor is part of that. It's an effort for people to try and make this society a better place, pursue their dreams, and hopefully combine these two ideas.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And I think, for me, that's an important sort of thing, is to understand that, kind of in the system we always like to look at the people like the Bill Gates, the Steve Jobs. And of course, as many criticisms I have of them and kind of their worldview and, the exploitation of companies like Apple and Microsoft and the all of that. That's definitely, a conversation for another time. What I want to get at is thinking about how many sort of really just ingenious people might be sort of kind of trapped in labor, being essentially forced to work like often 50 or 60 hours a week for just to be able to survive. You have how many millions of Einsteins out there, how many millions of people who might be able to bring great art or great innovations into this world, who just in kind of the horrifying system we live in are not given that opportunity. To use this dichotomy, like both manual and intellectual labor, people get kind of trapped in these systems. And, looking at the amount of resources UT has, looking at just how much money they're sitting on from things like the oil industry. Again, like the executives at UT are making plenty of money, but the wages for everybody else, the staff, the grad students, everybody is remaining stagnant. And that's not okay.
It's not. And I mean, in essence, UT just treats us as cheap labor. We're here to do a certain job and then we just leave and we just vanish. So in a sense, they don't really care about our academic improvement whatsoever. They just want to get the job done the cheapest way possible.
Yeah. So I'd like to now pivot a little bit to kind of what's being done to push back against this. What sort of actions have you been able to engage with so far, and how do you feel those? What sort of have the successes and the hardships kind of been as you've found yourself kind of within this struggle?
So the number one issue we have is that unfortunately we live in a society that most people are a little bit distant from the political realities, and we can feel the pain, but in the end of the day, you have to participate to make a change. So when we started, as I said at the beginning, it was January of this year, which was like 6 months ago or so, like 4 months ago. It was really hard to get in the room more than 10 people. And that's because people know that you have to put effort and that will be a lot of work. And so that's the number one hardship we had, just to convince people that this is a worthwhile movement to participate and spend their time. Over the months, we had a couple of events like town halls in the different colleges of UT where we presented the results of last year's survey that the Graduate Student Assembly did, and many people shared their experiences. So it was a really eye-opening and satisfying to see that all the data we have, the hard numbers, also have a face. So these town halls just put us in touch with the other fellow graduate students, and we start forging a bond with people. And that would make our movement a little bit much stronger, more steady. And of course, we had the May 1st International Workers' Day rally, in which essentially we gathered and we delivered a petition that was signed by more than 3,500 UT-affiliated people, whether they're graduate students, faculty, staff, undergraduates, and alumni. Probably I was like the best event I participate here in UT. I was so thrilled about it. There was so much momentum. And lastly, the grading, which was a response to the lack of proper reply from the administration to our petition. Essentially, they didn't address the points we brought up, and they didn't satisfy our request for tuition elimination for working graduate students.
And so what kind of was his response then, or what was the dean's general sort of feeling about that?
So the letter was addressed pretty much to Provost McInnes, and it was a pretty lukewarm response. She made the point that there's a graduate education task force working on figuring out the issues that graduate students are facing. But honestly, knowing that we're underpaid, that's a fact for the last 6-7 years. Do you really need another task force to tell you should pay them more? I mean, we know they're going to tell you pay them more, which is something that was already said in a previous task force in 2004 that UT had put together. And they told them, pay your graduate students more. So we know the problem and we know the solution. You just take more money from your accounting department and just distribute them accordingly. I mean, the problem is pretty basic to understand. The solution is also pretty basic to understand. This task force has been going on since January as a general response to show that we care, but that's it. They're just trying to show that they care. And one of the things they said is that they're going to spend $10 million like right now as a Band-Aid. And I'm like, that's not a sustainable solution. We just want something that will solve the issue in perpetuity, something that will raise the salaries, fix the tuition problem forever, not just for one semester. That's ridiculous. It's like, I mean, and they said that they're going to do it now, but that's a result of our efforts. After the grading, the provost sent an email saying, yeah, we acknowledge that this is a big issue that many people are facing. We're going to solve it. Had we not done the march and the grading in May, who knows when they were going to give us the money, if they were going to do anything about it. And let me tell you, I'm pretty sure they were just going to do something pretty minimal. And the solution that they present is of the form, we're going to give scholarships to the people most in need. Why don't we just do the simple thing? Raise everybody's salary and remove everybody's tuition. It's just pretty simple solution again. Baffling, as you said. It's why do we want to go through the scholarship system and whatnot? Right now, we're just graduate students, but it is important to include as many as possible of the underpaid people here at UT, whether they're custodians, adjuncts, and whatnot. So that's an important discussion to have within our movement. Now, withholding work, we haven't had a discussion about that. This is an important decision to discuss with all the members of the movement, and I cannot talk from my point of view, but essentially that's always something that people have used in the past and made a difference. I mean, look at the Oklahoma, West Virginia, Colorado, where the teachers just didn't show up to work and they show up to the respective legislative body and they said, you need to pay us more. That works too. But that's a big step to take, and we need to organize locally first, and we need to hear our members' voices and see what they want. What's the best way to serve them?
We're going to go ahead and have to wrap it up there. So much more I'd love to talk about on a later episode at some other point. We have been joined by Giorgos Stratis, who's a graduate student as well as one of the organizers with Underpaid at UT. Thank you very much for coming on the show today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Solidarity.
Yeah. That's all we have for this week. You have been listening to People's Republic with Brian Griffith. People's Republic originates on KOOP Austin and is also available as a podcast on Spreaker, Stitcher, iTunes, or wherever podcasts are podded. You can also find us on Facebook and Twitter at People's Radio ATX for more news and analysis. We are out of here.